and good morning. Welcome to today's edition of Our Homes Ending the Housing Crisis. My name is Ryan Catalani, and I'll once again be your host today. Our guest today is California State Senator Scott Wiener, who among many issues has worked on transportation, increasing access to healthcare, supporting working families, addressing climate change, and of course, making housing more affordable. Senator, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So can we just start off and maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself and in particular the state of housing in your district and in your state?
Sure. So thank you for having me today. And I am a California State Senator. I represent the entirety of San Francisco and then a portion of San Mateo County, which is the county directly south of San Francisco. I have lived in San Francisco in the Castro neighborhood for 23 years. I was a practicing attorney for about 15 years and an activist in the community. And then in 2010, I was elected to the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, and then in 2016 to the State Senate. In San Francisco, and in the Bay Area, California as a whole, but particularly in San Francisco and the Bay Area, we're in a real crisis around housing and have been for quite some time. The cost of housing is just through the roof. It has, led to enormous amounts of displacement, people just being pushed out, spikes in homelessness, people living in their cars. It's just it's the heart of so many of our problems around poverty, homelessness, pushing people into very long commutes, which undermines our climate goals. So it's a huge problem. And for a long time, it was considered more of a Bay Area problem in California, but it's really statewide now. And the polls in California consistently show housing and homelessness at the top. Even now with COVID and the economic collapse, housing and homelessness are still among the top few issues that people are focused on. So we've been able to make some progress the last few years, and there is more and more political momentum to fix this problem.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously have a very similar situation here too, which is why it'll be very interesting for us to hear about some of the steps you're trying to take to address that crisis. A lot of us, I know, are very eager to hear about SB 50 and those sorts of efforts. Can you tell us about the bill, its motivations, and what's happened in the political arena?
Around SB 50 in particular?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, SB 50, may it rest in peace. So SB 50, it was really a multi-year process. The original bill was SB 827, and then it became SB 50. And it's a bill that was a pretty basic proposition to say that our zoning in California is completely unsustainable. And then when you look at the reality that we have a multi-million home deficit, there are various reasons for that, but one of them is that we don't zone for enough housing. And zoning is like the basic foundational building block about how much housing is actually legal to build. And what we've done over the last 50 years in California is we've zoned about 70+% of our land only for single family homes, meaning that the only thing that is legal to build on 75% of the parcels in our state is one unit of housing, a single family home. So that is effectively a ban on apartment buildings, even small ones. It's a ban on affordable housing, because affordable housing is always built as multi-unit, a ban on public housing. It's a ban on anything other than a single family home. And that means that if you cannot afford a single family home in a given community, then that means you can't live in that community. It's also, so it puts a mathematical cap on how much housing you can build. It makes housing inherently more expensive. But it also is environmentally disastrous because particularly when you zone for only single family homes in the lion's share of, say, the Bay Area or LA, areas where the jobs are, where there's access to public transportation, we have transit stops in the Bay Area where you can't build anything around it other than a single family home, it means that you are forcing people, you're doing the opposite of what you should be doing. We need to have more people living close to where the jobs are, close to transit, so people can walk to transit, can walk to their jobs, or if they drive to their jobs, drive a shorter distance. And it induces sprawl because you can't build enough housing close in. So you build it further out, which gobbles up farmland, covers up open space, increases carbon emissions because people have to drive multiple hours each way to work. It's just for many, many reasons, it is unhealthy and unsustainable. And so the goal of SB 50 is very simple. So if you are close to high quality public transportation, or you're in a job-rich area, you can't limit zoning to only single-family homes. You have to allow small to mid-size multi-unit construction. So it overrode local zoning. It was very controversial, obviously, largely because you have communities and neighborhoods that they don't want multi-unit. We know that single-family home zoning was created 100 years ago, right after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down racial zoning. The reason that single-family home zoning came into existence was to keep primarily Black people, but also poor people, out of neighborhoods. Because if you ban apartment buildings and only people who can afford single-family homes can live there, you will effectively have segregation. And as late as the 1950s and 60s, there was a lot of explicit reference to keeping particularly Black people out of communities via single-family zoning. And today, it's still having that effect in terms of perpetuating segregation. That was the bill. We had a very broad progressive coalition behind it, but there was a lot of pushback from communities that didn't want to see any change, didn't want to see apartment buildings, didn't want lower income people in their community. And ultimately the bill came very close to passing out of the Senate, but we fell just short. But the bill also, even though it did not succeed itself, SB 50 completely revolutionized the housing conversation in California, completely changed it, engaged a much broader swath of people in those conversations. The polling on SB 50, there were 3 statewide polls done last year on the bill. All 3 polled in the 60s. Even older homeowners supported it, who are usually the least likely to support something like this. So with broad public support, and we saw a number of other bills that were able to get passed in those years that might have been more controversial had SB 50 not been in the room. And so I think we created space for a lot of other good work.
Yeah, and certainly not just the conversation in California. It got a lot of national coverage too, and I think is shifting the national conversation. It's a good point that you raised about, how eliminating single-family zoning might help to rectify some of the racial injustices that, this type of policy perpetuated. One thing that, one concern that was brought up was actually, though, from social justice advocates who feared, I think, maybe it didn't do enough to include affordable housing or protect existing tenants or vulnerable communities. How did you work to address their concerns?
Yeah, well, it was a complicated issue, and on every housing bill that I author, we include anything that's going to potentially, because you can always, there's good development, there's bad development. You can do housing development in a way that displaces people. So I always, in multiple of my bills, I put in strong anti-demolition, anti-displacement protections. We're not looking to induce demolition of housing where people are living or have lived recently. We want to be additive, add to housing, not replace who's living there. So in SB 50, for example, we work very closely with housing equity groups to craft some strong anti-demolition protections, to put a delayed implementation for what we refer to as sensitive communities at risk of displacement. And then we did have an inclusionary percentage in the bill of 15% unless the local inclusionary was higher. We had very strong progressive support for the bill. One of our sponsors was a broad consortium of nonprofit affordable housing developers that all they do is build low-income housing. And the affordable housing builder community, the nonprofits, were very, very supportive of the bill because they knew this was going to open up a vast amount of land that would make it legal to build affordable housing there. Because if it's single family zoned, you can't. And so they supported the bill. We had broad environmental support, broad labor support, groups like AARP and Habitat for Humanity support. But there were some social justice groups that did not support the bill. We worked intensively with them for like a year and a half. And ultimately, in the end, they were asking for some things that we could not give. If you make the inclusionary really high, it might look good, it's a high percentage, but if it means that nothing gets built or very little gets built, then you're not getting very much out of it. And so we had the bill survive. I'm confident that we would have reached a resolution with them eventually, but we ran out of time to do that. But we did have very strong anti-displacement protections in the bill.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously a tough balancing act between so many different, needs and concerns. So where does it go from here? We saw some references to SB 902. I think you called it sort of a lighter touch version of this bill.
Yeah. So SB 50 was very difficult in the Senate, and I was working with my colleagues, talked to people for several years on it. It caused it was a rough time. 2 minutes after the bill died on the floor, the president of the Senate, Senator Toni Atkins from San Diego, she got up and said, "This is not over. We're going to continue working, and we're going to put together a strong Senate housing production package this year." And she made that commitment, and she convened a working group of senators who were not the partisans, folks in the middle, some who supported, some who opposed, to sort of come up with some principles and some ideas. And then COVID hit, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. Our session was in flux, as it was in all 50 states, but we did come back, and our leader kept her word and kept moving forward. And so we have a package of bills this year, of solid bills. The Assembly does as well. I have two of them. One is, as you mentioned, SB 902, which is a bill that gives cities a very powerful new tool, because there are plenty of cities that would like to upzone in parts of their cities, but the process, because of our environmental laws and other processes, make it really hard, lengthy, it can take many years, and expensive for cities to do it. So there's an incentive for them to avoid it. So SB 902 provides that when a city upzones, they can upzone up to 10-unit apartment buildings without going through any of the environmental laws, as long as it's not sprawl, as long as it's near transit or jobs, or it's an infill development, so it's environmentally sustainable. They can go up to 10 units without going through, just quickly. So they can just adopt an ordinance and do it. And a lot of the cities really are looking forward to this. It's going to make their lives easier, and they're going to be able to implement their plans a lot more easily. I also have a bill, SB 899, that some call it the YIGBY bill, Yes in God's Backyard. It allows religious nonprofits, most particularly churches, as well as nonprofit colleges, to use their excess land to build 100% affordable housing. We have a lot of churches in particular that have a lot of excess land. It might be that they have a mega parking lot and they have a declining congregation or other kinds of excess land. They want to build affordable housing, whether it's for low-income seniors or formerly homeless people or whatnot. But the local zoning and approvals just make it impossible for them to do that. It will also help them, if they are, a declining congregation, they can maybe get some more revenue. And so the bill will basically allow them to have the zoning and by right approval under certain constraints to build 100% affordable housing on their land. So that bill is getting good support. We're having some tension with labor now because labor has changed its mind in terms of the labor protections that it wants in the bill. I put in the labor protections that we've always worked with them on for affordable housing, change their mind. So we're trying to work through that. We also have legislation, SB 1120, that will provide statewide duplex zoning. So two units almost everywhere. And as of right, so ministerial approval, and also ministerial approval for lot splits. So if the lot is big enough, you can split it by right, and you can do a duplex on each one, so effectively fourplex. We have a couple of bills that are that allow for commercial properties to be automatically rezoned for residential or mixed use. We have in California, particularly in Southern California, but elsewhere, other parts of the state too, dine shopping malls, other kinds of commercial uses that really should be redeveloped. And there are a couple of bills that will allow that to happen. We have our state density bonus, affordable housing density bonus, that allows you to, if you have a certain level of affordability, you can override some local rules, like go a little taller or more dense or so forth, less parking. That's been around for 40 years. There are a couple bills this year to make that density bonus even more robust. So we have, a number of different bills that if we're able to pass all of them, I think we would have some really nice progress.
And I'm sure that a lot of our audiences was busily taking notes on these policy ideas for our next session here. There are a lot of policy levers you can push, I guess, on the housing crisis. How have you decided to, sort of hone in on this zoning reform or upzoning or, densification as sort of your main lever?
Well, I haven't only done that, even though that's been the most, high profile. My first year in office in 2017, I authored and we passed a major housing streamlining bill, Senate Bill 35, which provides that if the city is not meeting its housing goal, it becomes streamlined, meaning ministerial approval. And that bill, in the few years it's been in effect, has had an accelerating impact. We're now every few days hearing about a new project in the state, often 100% affordable housing, but others as well. And also housing that's getting approved in exclusionary communities that never allow housing, but now they're being forced to allow it. And we're finding, although there are some communities that will fight it and look for any loophole or technicality, there are other communities where they have had a terrible track record approving housing, but the city council and the planning department are welcoming this because it's like, great, we have to approve it. Sorry, everyone, the state's forcing us to do it. So that's been a very successful streamlining law, and we've seen some other streamlining laws as well. I also authored in 2018 SB 828, which reforms how we set housing goals, because California's housing goals, it's called RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Assessment. It is, we set these absurdly low numbers in general, and in particular for more powerful cities politically. And so it completely revamped it, and we're now seeing housing goals set that are for regions that are like 3 times what they were before, and communities that had always gotten low allocations because of their political strength are now getting much larger allocations. And so that's good. In terms of zoning, when I authored that streamlining bill, SB 35 in 2017, people kept coming up to me and saying, hey, this is great, it's a good bill, but you know what? You have to address zoning. Until you address zoning, it's going to make it really hard. And that's when I started working on what became SB 50. But the zoning piece really it's like this intersection of housing affordability and environmental sustainability. Because low density zoning is so damaging to the environment, and it is what causes sprawl. And so, as I'm also an ardent environmentalist, it's a huge priority for me and my constituents, and this is about the future of the planet. And so zoning really gets at that intersection. And it really also gets to our history of structural racism in this country. We see structural racism playing out around policing and the criminal justice system. We see it in the healthcare system in terms of what's happening around COVID and the racial disparities. We see it in our education system, including now these disparities that are happening because of remote learning. Because guess who's getting hurt the most? It's not people who look like me. And now in the history of racism in housing, and zoning is a really critical part of that. So, in terms of racial justice, environmental sustainability, housing affordability, zoning really, really matters.
That's a great way of putting it. And, I think it's something that we're really talking about in Hawaii also locally. So very relevant to us as well. One of our previous guests on this webinar was Rick Holliday, who started something called Factory OS to build more modular or offsite construction. What are your thoughts on the future of modular construction in California?
Well, I think modular definitely has an important role in the future, and whatever people think of it, it exists, it's happening, and I don't think it's at mass scale yet, but it does have a role to play in the future. I do think that we have to work through the issues with labor. We want to make sure that we are putting people to work and have a construction workforce that's not being paid poverty wages. And so that's important. We have had a split in California where the carpenters union is part of Factory OS. So they've embraced modular housing. Other trades have not. So that has to be worked through, but subject to that, I do think it is part of the future.
And, do you have any thoughts on sort of the politics or the process of getting construction unions to back more affordable housing projects?
I could write a book on the politics of labor and housing. I've been at the center of a lot of it, and I have, I'm having a little bit of tension with the trades now. I've been a longtime ally of the trades. I do strongly believe that we want to have a construction workforce that is a pathway to the middle class, and that's very important. And so I'm very supportive of the trades. It's very complicated. I mean, I think the trades are natural allies to those of us advocating for more housing. They build that housing. They need places to live too. There are times when there are some disagreements because we, want to make sure that it's a needle you have to thread. And sometimes, as with any stakeholder process, you're going to have some disagreements. But I view the trades as allies in our quest for more housing. And that's why we work with them so closely.
And I'm sorry if I bounce between subject areas. I want to remind the audience that you can submit questions through the Q&A or the chat, and I'll try to get to them as with those. Another question, some of your efforts have focused on developing housing through the private sector. What role do you think direct government provision of public housing plays, such as in Singapore or Vienna, or 1960s HUD policy in overcoming the housing shortage?
Yeah, I mean, my housing work hasn't just focused on private construction of housing. A lot of the legislation I've authored is either entirely or significantly about subsidized below market rate affordable housing. SB 50 was certainly like that. SB 35, our streamlining bill, and then of course the religious and other nonprofit affordable housing bill I'm working on now. So we do a lot of work on both. In addition, I am co-authoring a constitutional amendment to repeal Article 34 of the California Constitution. In 1950, California passed a racist constitutional amendment to require that any public housing project had to be approved on the ballot by the voters. no other form of housing was required to have that approval, only public housing. And it was done explicitly to keep low-income people, people of color out of wealthier neighborhoods. So it's a despicable constitutional amendment. It's still in our Constitution. So we're trying to get it on the ballot to repeal that. And that will help us be able to build more, whatever you want to call it, social housing, public housing, affordable housing. And so that's something I'm committed to. I think the government has a huge role to play in housing. And we used to play that, we used to have that government role in the United States in the middle part of the century. And then, you know, under Ronald Reagan, it really just started to get obliterated. So we need a much greater federal and state investment in public or social housing. We need more of a housing safety net for low-income people. That's the best way to prevent and end homelessness. And so I hope we can get back to that.
Yeah, makes sense. And it certainly needs to operate on multiple levels. There's the supply side issues, which, you know, are undeniable. I think you said that housing's California shortage is basically equivalent to the whole rest of the country combined. And, you know, there are, you know, for the existing tenants or people in housing currently, you know, protections needed for them too. Have you had any efforts on, you know, tenant protections, rent control? What are your thoughts on those sorts of policies?
Yeah, no, I support rent control. We have it in San Francisco. You know, no system is perfect, but it has really stabilized a lot of people in their housing. So it's very important. And last year we passed, and I co-authored legislation with my own assembly member, David Chu, who I know Senator Chang knows well, to create a statewide rent cap and statewide just cause eviction protections for renters. So I was proud to co-author that, and I'm glad that we were able to get it done. And Governor Newsom played a really important role in making sure that that happened. This year because we have several COVID-related bills that I'm co-authoring to try to really stabilize renters during this pandemic, people who have lost their jobs. If they've not already fallen behind on their rent, they almost certainly will in the coming months. And we need to avoid mass evictions, which will lead to a spike in homelessness. Excuse me. And so we have several pretty robust bills, excuse me, this year, and some different models about how we keep people stabilized.
Yeah, we actually have Matthew Desmond, not in this webinar series, but speaking to Hawaii
That'd be great
audience
if you were here.
next week. Yeah. And, you know, I was just reading this morning that San Francisco passed legislation to ban landlords from evicting tenants for missing rent due to COVID-19 related issues like job loss or infection.
Yeah, and we have a similar bill pending in the legislature.
Okay, and those are going to be hugely important here as well, in Hawaii, I mean. On going back to the labor issue for a second, an audience question. What are the areas between trades and affordable housing that we need to thread together, do you think?
Well, in California, unfortunately, there's a pretty negative relationship between the building trades and the affordable housing nonprofit developers. They've been on again, off again fighting for a few decades now, and that fight has renewed this year. And I very much want to bring them together to try to resolve it, because it's just not a good fight. It's a fight we should be resolving. But right now, we need to wait for cooler heads to prevail, because it's sort of a difficult tension. But that is an ongoing issue in California.
Going back to upzoning also for a second. So, you know, of course, with upzoning, which is intended to increase density usually, it would likely require upgrades in infrastructure, water mains, things like that. Do you have any thoughts about how those infrastructure upgrades would be funded?
Yeah, and I think the infrastructure argument is used by some to oppose new housing. It's one of the most common anti-growth arguments. Until you perfect the infrastructure, you can't have housing. And while I am a strong supporter of upgrading and improving our infrastructure, and I've over the years supported and authored and campaigned for many bonds and revenues and other ways of increasing our investment, whether it's sewer or water or transportation or our roads or public transportation, you have to do both. We need new housing, we need more infrastructure, and you can't make one dependent on the other. And as soon as you say, we're not going to build housing until the infrastructure is perfected, that's saying we're not going to build new housing. The way that cities evolve, it's never perfect, right? Unless you have a pre-planned city, one of those rare cities. Maybe you get behind on the infrastructure and then you catch up, or behind on the housing and then you catch up. You can't. It's very unwise to condition one on the other. And anyone who argues don't build the housing until you perfected the infrastructure, that is a classic NIMBY argument. And so it's also an argument to say, okay, you don't get a home until the infrastructure is perfect. So until we perfect the infrastructure, you get to live 2 hours away. So bye, I'll see you later. You're not welcome here anymore because we don't have the infrastructure for you. That's a terrible argument. So I'm all for making aggressive investments in infrastructure. We don't want, it's terrible for communities when you have inadequate basic infrastructure, but you can't, we should not make housing depend on infrastructure. People are living in cars. People are living in parks. People are overcrowded in homes, and I'm not going to go and tell them you don't get a house because we have work to do on the water system. Sorry, it's a bad argument.
Right. Thanks. Another audience question. It seems like the change in California to allow ADUs was a way to get many homeowners on board with increased density, literally in their own backyards, because of the somewhat incremental nature of the bill and because they got to own and control the density. Are there other initiatives in the works that have the ability to increase affordable housing, affordable rental stock that also has widespread support from homeowners?
Well, I think a lot of these housing efforts have widespread support from homeowners. I think that people sometimes assume that the loudest voices, the people who are showing up at town halls and showing up at City Hall, and having email groups and very vocal on Facebook, that these people represent this inherent resistance to housing by homeowners. And the reality is that when you look at actual polls where you're polling a broad cross-section, even homeowners are supportive of adding a lot more housing in their own neighborhood. Their renters have higher support. Younger people have higher support than older people. People of color have higher support than white people. But even older homeowners over 50, support more housing. And so I think most people get it, but you end up sometimes, we fall into the trap of, well, the loudest voices must represent what the community wants. And let's be clear that ADUs, there was enormous resistance to ADUs for a long time. And there still is in a lot of areas. So even though, yes, you might be like thrilled to be able to put that density in your backyard, your neighbors might not be so happy about it. And so for a long time, we had an ADU requirement under California law, and cities just ignored it, and it had no teeth. Over the last 5 years, we have gradually and methodically shut down all the loopholes. And now it's much harder for cities to say no or impossible. And more cities have embraced it. And now what we hear is, well, don't do like an SB 50. We just want to do ADUs. ADUs are awesome. We love them. And I agree, ADUs are a key part of the solution, but we can't solve the crisis only with ADUs. We just won't get the numbers that we need.
Well, on the subject of homeowner support, I mean, that resonates with something in Hawaii too, with, a lot of I would say parents, grandparents are concerned about their kids or their grandkids leaving for the continent, the mainland, and never coming back. And a lot of that has to do with being able to afford to live here and have a home here. It's the same thing. Now, that said, there are certain communities, like in Venice or in Belgium, that maybe perhaps we've decided should be preserved exactly as is for all time. If the people of California truly believe that their community should not grow, and that it's okay for people to migrate, young people to migrate to other communities that are maybe more pro-growth, should we respect that?
No. And there are cities like a Venice that have decided to become a museum, a tourist museum. That's their choice. I don't know what the average age is in Venice, or I don't know, but it's not that's a very niche choice to make, and there are very few cities that can do that, right? There are some cities that could say, like a Venice, we're just going to become a museum for tourist purposes, and that'll work for us. That doesn't work for the vast majority of cities. It's an illusion for the vast majority of cities that we're going to become a tourist attraction because our suburb is going to be frozen in amber. And instead, what you do is you strangle yourself because, as you noted, young people can't afford to live there. And if they do, they're going to stay and eventually go. And so your average age goes up. And as someone who just turned 50, I love being 50. I love 50-year-olds are great. 60-year-olds, 80-year-olds are great. But we're not like enough. You have to have young people too, and you have to have a lot of young people. You have to have kids and families, and we have places in the Bay Area that are closing down schools because families can't afford to live there. They're leaving, and so declining enrollment, and you end up completely sabotaging your economy because employers, over time, we're seeing this in the Bay Area now, where some of our major employers, they're not leaving, but they're expanding elsewhere, where their workers are actually going to be able to find homes. And this is pre-COVID, and so you just really you strangle yourself when you do that. Communities must change to survive. That doesn't mean you have to have immediate, radical, chaotic change, but you have to be willing to change, or you will ultimately die. And that is, it's just not healthy for any community.
Mm-hmm. And an audience member points out that Venice has 50,000 residents in a city with 20 million tourists per year.
And again, for Venice, it's great. I mean, it's great. They're in a position where they can do that, and that's what they do, and that's their economy. But that works for probably 0.001% of cities on the planet.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and they point out, there have been reports about other cities in Europe that tourism has actually pushed residents out of housing. How do you think places should strike a balance?
Yeah, well, we have to be careful, and we've dealt with this. We had our Airbnb wars in San Francisco for many years, and we put strong regulations in place to say short-term rentals have a role to play, and it does help with tourism, and there are many benefits of it, but you can't cannibalize housing stock. And so in San Francisco, you can't just have a unit of housing that's only short-term rentals. You have to have a resident who lives there. They can do it for up to 90 days a year while they're not there, but the rest of the time they have to be there. And so we tried to strike a balance to say we'll accept short-term rentals and legalize them, but we're not going to allow housing stock to be cannibalized. Because as soon as you do that, you will see people getting pushed out because it's more lucrative to have a short-term rental than a regular tenant. So what San Francisco also did is we set up an enforcement office specific for short-term rentals. And so it's very hard to do enforcement on short-term rentals, but San Francisco, I think, does a really good job, and they have shut down a large number of illegal short-term rentals. And we were able to get agreement with the platforms that you can't list in San Francisco property unless you have a city registration number listed. And that allows some accountability, that has been registered, and they monitor the listings, and they really have cracked down on the bad actors.
So last week, and shifting gears just a little bit, we had Susan Kirsch from a group called Livable California on the webinar, who said she'd like to meet you and find areas of common ground. Do you think do you have any areas of common ground with her, and with those more broadly advocating for what she calls local control of housing decisions?
Yeah, we have a lot of disagreements, many, but there's always common ground. And in fact, Livable California, which has always opposed my housing legislation, just endorsed my church affordable housing bill. So there you go, common ground. So yeah, no, I've met Susan briefly before in the Capitol, but I, of course, would be happy to sit down with her. We live very close to her. She lives in, I think, Mill Valley, which is right north of the Golden Gate Bridge. So she lives like a 15-minute drive from where I live.
She also said that she's in favor of raising taxes on the rich by raising the highest marginal personal income tax rate to 90%, which is revenue that I guess could be dedicated to affordable housing potentially. Do you think that's an area you could work on legislation together on?
I mean, I've been a supporter of progressive taxation, so I support having a good, healthy tax rate on high earners. I support a wealth tax. I have authored repeatedly and unsuccessfully a California estate tax, and so I support taxing corporations. I'm a supporter of progressive taxation. I don't know. 90% seems pretty high to me, but I certainly am a supporter of progressive taxation.
Now, people, here's an audience question sort of on this subject. People living in settled, middle-class, single-family neighborhoods don't want to see property values lowered by more dense apartments and show up in great numbers to fight change. What's your response at the local level to this fear?
A couple things. I don't think we should allow people's property values to dictate whether we can avoid having people living in their cars. I mean, this is a societal problem that we have to solve, and we can't let people's property values drive that. With that said, I dispute the notion that allowing, apartment buildings in the neighborhood lowers property values. I don't think there's any data to support that. And in fact, one of the critiques of SB 50 was, well, if you zone these parcels for more density, you're going to increase land values, and we should recapture that, through a land value tax or something like that. And that's a perfectly acceptable conversation to have, but I don't think that zoning for more density lowers property values. If anything, it's the opposite.
Looks like we might potentially have a live question. I'll see if I can allow Reverend Domingo to speak here. Should be allowed to chime in.
Looks like he's still muted.
How's that?
There we go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, great. Sorry, I've just joined in, but I noticed, Scott, that you were part of a group of legislators that helped pass the public banking bill last year in California. So I'm very much interested in that because we tried to do a little campaign here a couple of years ago with great fanfare and great failure. But nonetheless, California is now the second state in the union that has public banking legislation and a system next to North Dakota. So, and I know that one of the challenges that, because of affordable housing challenges that you've had, that's one of the reasons why you did pass the bill. Is that correct? To help?
I think that was one. I think in general, I co-authored. I wasn't the lead author on that bill.
Yes.
I co-authored it. But that, just the idea that there should be a public bank alternative for a variety of reasons. Funding affordable housing was one of them, but not the only reason.
Okay. Because that's what I see as being a potential for us here in Hawaii. We've had a real challenge with financing here, and it's been very slow to come by. And so I'm thinking if we were able to at least move to that point, that would really help with the projects and the funding of financing of projects here.
Yeah, I mean, you should go for it, and don't, sometimes these things you have to do it 3, 4, 5 times.
Yes.
These are complex, controversial issues, whether it's housing or public banking or anything else, and just got to persevere and keep coming back and not taking no for an answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So a couple more audience questions while we're on this. What do you think about the globalization or financialization of housing?
It is concerning to me, and particularly we're seeing increasingly the snapping up of single-family homes, foreclosed homes, et cetera. And I think a lot of us are worried that we're going to see that around COVID as well. And so you see, housing stock that was traditionally either owner-occupied or was renter-occupied by small landlords or with small landlords. And now you have these conglomerates, like a BlackRock, that come in and just own a huge swath of it. That is very concerning to me. It's hard to find policy levers to stop that from happening. I do think that we've traditionally, California has not typically allowed rent control on single family homes, just on multi-unit. I do think we should have rent control on when you have ownership of, significant number of single family homes, because you end up creating a class of renters that have little or no protections.
Thanks. Another question. Matthew Desmond speaks to the benefit of vouchers in addressing housing problems and evictions. Do you have any thoughts on vouchers as a method of mitigating the housing crisis? And is this policy method included in the 2020 housing package?
I'm a huge fan of housing vouchers. It's in some ways the most financially efficient way of keeping people stable in housing. Building new affordable or public housing is great and it's important. It's also very expensive. If you can just give people vouchers so they can stay in their homes, not become homeless, because it's much harder to rehouse someone after they become homeless, that's really important. The Section 8 program is not what it used to be. I would love to see that be more robust. We don't have that at the state level, although we did last year pass legislation to prohibit landlords from discriminating against Section 8 voucher holders. And that was an important step in California. We were way behind other states in that. But yes, I'd like to see a significant expansion of housing voucher programs.
Mm-hmm. Jumping back to tourism for a second, do you think that tourism businesses should be compelled to provide housing for their low-income employees, like cruise ships as an example here?
It depends. I mean, there might be certain industries where it makes sense. But in general, I'm very leery of having a company town model come back. When you talk about your employer, your boss is also your landlord, that's sort of a dangerous situation. And again, there are some scenarios where that makes sense, just given the nature of the job and the location. And we see that, like, oil workers working on a remote oil field. Yeah, the employer is going to build housing for them. Farm workers. We've done a lot of work around farm worker. But even with farm worker housing, we've made sure that the employer does not have direct control in terms of landlord responsibilities. So I don't, it makes me nervous when we start moving towards the company town model, which is what that argument leads to. And I don't know that we should tell employers that it's your job to fix the housing mess that we created, right? Employers don't issue building permits. They don't set zoning. they don't make any of these decisions. So when people would say in the Bay Area, well, Google and Facebook and Apple, they should be building housing for their workers. I'm like, no, they shouldn't. They should be part of the solution and helping. And if they want to, that's fine. I know, and they are doing that. But Facebook for years, and Google, were trying to build housing for their workers. But guess what? They couldn't, because Mountain View and Menlo Park wouldn't let them do it. So the notion that it's like all in the employers, I think it's great when big companies contribute to affordable housing funds, when they engage in advocacy for pro-housing policies. That's great and that's important, and I support it. But we cannot shirk our own responsibility as office holders, as voters. It's our responsibility. We created this bad system that has driven the car into a ditch. And the employers are part of the solution, but we can't just say, you do it, you fix it. We have to fix it.
You know, on the matter of systematic issues, in Hawaii, you may have heard of, there's been this resurgent movement of activists in the last few years, led largely by Native Hawaiians who are speaking up about their historic and even their current disenfranchisement in political and civic processes, which you may have heard has come to a head recently on a Big Island telescope project. There's a wind farm project on Oahu where I am, with people actually chaining themselves to roadways to stop construction. How do you think policymakers should respond to and work with movements like these?
We have to work with all communities, and we have to work with our Native communities, and we're doing that in California. We actually there's a bill right now where we're working through some sort of thorny issues to protect sacred sites from development, which I support. It's more complicated than our general shared goal, but I know we'll get there. And so, yeah, you have to. We can't leave any community behind, and we shouldn't be discarding not just our own history, but the history of the communities that were here first.
Well, we have just a few more minutes, so we wanted to ask you some broader questions about your work too. You were on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, now of course a state senator, and you've tackled such a wide array of issues, not just housing, but paid parental leave, renewable energy, net neutrality, the estate tax, as you mentioned, so many things. Does your support for these issues come out of a basic philosophy or some sort of basic set of principles?
I come from, I'm Jewish, I'm gay. I come from different traditions where progressive politics is what allows us to survive and to thrive. And I think for me, we see what happens when we have sort of conservative governance. The communities, our most marginalized communities, that get harmed, people really get left behind, inequities that form. We're seeing that now after decades of sort of bad economic policy and housing policy. And so, for me, this is just about making sure that everyone has the ability to succeed in life, and that we don't create effectively like a caste system or a system where there's like a nobility and an underclass. It's so unhealthy. Countries that have these divisions and these inequities don't succeed. And we need to really do more, and that's what motivates much of my work. In addition to trying to not have the planet burn up, trying to definitely avoid having the planet burn up.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm looking at the ocean now. During your years in public office, have your views about public policy or how government works, or even how democracy works, have those views shifted over the last decade?
I mean, I think, yeah, on a lot of issues, and the more you're around different issues, your views shift, and you become, often more progressive in some areas, maybe sometimes a little more middle of the road in some areas, just depending on the issue and seeing how things actually work in practice. And so I try to always keep, I have core values, But I'm willing to admit there have been times when I'm wrong. You know, someone will criticize me for a position I took 5 years ago, and if I, you know, often defend that and say this is why I did it. You can disagree. Sometimes I'll be like, you know what, I was wrong, and I've since learned. One of those issues for me is on policing, where I've always been pro-reform, but I think, you know, years back, just again based on my own lived experience, I think that I had a lot of learning to do, and I've, you know, tried really hard to do that learning over the years, and I wouldn't say very different, but a somewhat different place now than I was, you know, 6-7 years ago. And you have to be willing to keep an open mind and listen, and to acknowledge when you've been wrong in the past.
I think that's a great lesson for all of us. Just very briefly, one last question. What are your plans for the future? Is there anything we should be looking out for?
Well, I'm up for re-election this year, so that's a issue I'm dealing with now. But our session ends on August 31st. So we have 5 more weeks. It's going to be a marathon, 5 weeks. And then we're planned for next year. And obviously we don't know what's going to happen with this pandemic. And so it's a little tumultuous and unpredictable at the moment. But, you know, we'll continue to work on all criminal justice reform, housing, LGBT and immigrant rights. So it's a lot of work to do.
Well, we will be following along. I know you're on Twitter, you're on Instagram. Is there any other ways we should keep in touch with you?
Or Facebook, those are all good ways.
Excellent. Well, thank you again to our guest, Senator Scott Wiener, for taking time out of your very busy schedule these days. Yeah. And we appreciate your insights on housing here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thanks. And to our attendees, as you're leaving, just take this poll to let us know how we did today. Thanks again for joining us at this edition of Our Homes, and we'll see you next week.